Dude, what about that link you sent?
So good.
Man.
Man.
I only clicked a few. We'll have to put that in the description because I think people would like to see that.
Absolutely. It's like the internet iceberg, and it's like top of the iceberg. I guess it's like a meme. I didn't really understand.
I was just thinking it's like, just the phrase like tip of the iceberg. Like you think
there's
PDFs being turned complete is craziest thing in computer programming? That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, that's just
yeah.
But it goes down, and the stuff at the bottom is wild. So
dude, it's insane.
A lot of the stuff at the top, I had heard like Little Bobby Tables, and there was a lot, but like down the stuff near the bottom, I didn't.
Dude,
I read one called Coding Machines. It's like a fictional short story.
For people listening, it's just there's a website that Jeff Atwood tweeted out that has like the craziest stuff in programming, like the weirdest kind of treasure trove of like just kind of odd, facts or like peculiarities or bugs in software or the way things work. And it's just fun.
It's like a weird history of computing. Yeah. It's so good.
It's so good.
Anyway, I read at the very bottom, at the bottom of the iceberg, called Coding Machines. It's like a short story. It was long. It's extremely well written. It is extremely.
You read the whole thing?
Oh man, I couldn't
stop reading it.
Oh, and man, it's just like, it's so good. I'm going to open that website like every night
and just read
one thing.
That's great. What was that story about?
I don't want to
spoil it.
I don't want to spoil it, but I'll link the story in the show notes.
Oh, awesome.
And man, it's you'll love it, man.
Oh, cool.
It's like
I'll have to read it.
That Neil Stephenson like style. Oh, it's
Dude, you sent it to me in Slack and you were like, careful, rabbit holes ahead. And I was like so tired of watching TV. I was like, oh, I'll just check this out. I'm not gonna be interested. It was like 30 minutes later and I was like, okay, I gotta close this.
Well, you want to talk about the one you sent me?
Oh, there was a couple that I saw that were crazy. This guy exploited a bug in Super Mario and hand wrote via Mario commands the source code of Flappy Bird, reusing the sprites from the game, and then was playing Flappy Bird on an original unmodified NES system. And it was incredible. He did it in an hour.
He code injected it with his fingers. Yeah. I mean, it is ridiculous.
I know. Every time you do a spin jump and there's one part of the level you can write a byte. And this guy needs to get a girlfriend, but you know what I'm saying.
No, he doesn't. He needs to make more of these.
Yeah. Man. Oh man, it was so cool. And then the other one, well, the original bug, I had never seen that.
Yeah.
It was literally a moth that had burn the silicon or the
relay or something.
Yeah, that's the first bug. That's so cool.
Yeah,
and you debug the machine, take them off. That was really cool. What was another one that I put in there? There was another cool one. I got it right here.
Oh, PDFs are turning complete.
Oh yeah, PDFs are turning complete, which is crazy. Oh yeah, there's a method in the Android API for Android apps that is called "Is User a Monkey?"
Do you know what?
It's literally on the docs page, and it says returns true if the user interface is currently being messed with by a monkey.
Do you know what that is? Okay, so I did some digging on this. Monkey is the name of
the Chaos Monkey stuff.
No, that was a Netflix thing, but similar idea. Monkey is the name of the test framework that I guess Google internally uses for Android. So that method leaked in the docs, and no one knew what it was. So there were all these Stack Overflow questions about it.
I see.
What does this mean? Like, I can really tell if the monkey is using it. And then I think they linked to a Stack Overflow, but there is a Stack Overflow somewhere. I found a thing that was like, no, monkey's a test framework, and this will let you know if you're running under test. And there was a whole thing about this is actually an anti-pattern because your production code shouldn't know if it's running under test or not. Can we stick to the monkeys?
Right. Oh my gosh, that's great. Yeah, that was cool. Cool. Well, we've had a fun week so far. It's Thursday, January 27th. I like when podcasts say what day we're recording on, because then you listen to it. No, it's kind of fun. Remember what period in time it was. But
you gotta say the year, man.
Yeah, 2022. That's true. And this is our fourth week in the new year, right?
Sure.
I think it is because I'm going to publish my fourth video this week, which is awesome.
Nice.
At the beginning of the year, we said we want to get back on a weekly publishing schedule on our YouTube channels, and we've been hitting it. And I just happened to fall into some suspense stuff, so we can talk a little bit about that. We have some other topics. So let's talk about this week. So my video is going to be on suspense and wrapping an observer with a callback into an async function you can use to suspend your app. And we had like we were going to podcast 2 days ago. Was it on Tuesday? And then 5 hours later, we were like, our brains were
we had to go for
mush.
a walk.
Yeah, literally. Because we started down this path, and it came about because I was working on my side project, which uses Firebase for authentication. And I had started using Suspense, and I had written some code that let me suspend the application until I got the initial auth state of the browser. So whether you were authenticated or anonymous. And I had some weird stuff where I, create, in order to suspend, you have to throw a promise. And then when that promise resolves, React will try to re-render your application. This is actually pretty cool. We're going to get into this because I'm sure we just keep talking about this 9 ways till Sunday. 7 ways to Sunday. 9 ways. What's the expression? Resolving a promise is a new way to trigger React to re-render your application. I hadn't really thought of that. So up until now, the only way to re-render your app is to call set state. But now you can do it by resolving a promise if you throw it and if you're using Suspense. Interesting.
I'm trying to think like what this unlocks other than the stuff we've already done with Suspense. But
I think it's it's a bridge between all this stuff, because now if you have some code running a module scope, running somewhere else outside of your React application, and it's asynchronous, you can just call resolve.
Yeah. Okay, because this goes to the thing like I need to, if setting state is a way to re-render, then I need to close over all my setup code.
Or I need to do the setup code within a component, which is why we use useEffects.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
But now if you just resolve the promise, you can trigger a re-render. So let me set the stage a little bit for listeners.
Yep.
So basically, the way you get the initial auth state from Firebase is by using this import called onAuthStateChanged. It sets up a listener for the auth state change. They call it an observer. It's a listener, whatever. And it gives you a callback that runs every time it changes. So you'd have 2 browser windows open. One of them you could log in, and the other one would get this callback fired. You could be logged in, close the browser, reopen it, and then this callback will fire as soon as it verifies the session is still authentic.
You can also click sign out.
You can click sign out, and it'll change, and the callback will run. So this is the one way to get the auth state from Firebase. And it is not obvious when you start working with Suspense how you might get a component to suspend the tree while you're waiting for this callback to happen.
Right. Well, and can we just compare it to something like fetch?
Exactly.
Fetch returns a promise. So how do I get my component to suspend while it's fetching? I can just throw fetch.
Exactly.
So now there's a little more detail
there's a little more
involved,
to it, but you can use a library like Apollo or SWR and say suspense true and pass it in fetch, which is an async function, and it's going to take care of throwing a promise that is stable and React can read again once it's resolved and all this stuff. So that's why those libraries, it's so easy to turn a data fetch into a suspending data fetch because of this. But when you're working with a library like this, or that interface with like an observer and a callback, it's not obvious. So then the video basically covers this. It creates a promise in module scope. It throws it if the data is not there yet, which is just referencing a variable in module scope as well. And then you update that variable, you call resolve. And then the next time that React tries to re-render your component, it has the user, so it doesn't throw the promise, and it goes on and keeps rendering. So that's what we did. That's what I did for the video. That's where we landed for the demo, and then we got into this long discussion about like updates and what did we figure out from Tuesday? Like what were we talking about, and what did we learn?
So we have some code that just naturally works really well with Suspense. So this is everything from like fetch, from like use SWR, to even your video where you wrap this observer, this event listener in a promise,
right,
and then throw that promise. Like there was some wrapping, but it works really well with Suspense.
It's a great bridge. And then you have this get initial auth state function that you can use to suspend any component that needs to wait until you know the auth state in order to render.
Right. But then there's some other code like a lot of router implementations.
Right.
And these router implementations, the way they work today, the way they have to work today, because like we're not in a world that's fully suspense yet. The way they work is by using an effect that's going to, read the window location. And so they'll often return a flag like is ready. And
Next
then,
does this.
Yeah. So is ready will be false on your first render. They set up in an effect. The effect runs, and then is ready turns to true, and you're ready to go. And so you get into this kind of this way of thinking where it's like, okay, I've got my app suspended for like these data fetches and these on-off state change callbacks. Can I make my app suspend until my router's ready? And it turns out like this is actually it's the answer is no.
It's either impossible or it's really hard. We couldn't figure it out.
It's really up to the routing library
we tried to
suspend.
Yeah.
You can make you can use like kind of like a subset of suspense here where like you start setting up component boundaries where like you get the router and a root component.
That's right. We went down this whole thing where you make a suspend until condition, and you make a component that takes in a prop, and if the prop happens to be false, it could like throw a promise.
It could throw a promise,
and then it's not the promise resolving that triggers the re-render. The promise never actually resolves, but the prop changes, and then so the component tries to re-render, and now that the condition is false, it doesn't ever throw.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you have something like that.
But this is like
so
is
that
like
you
a
can take
subset.
advantage of your suspense boundaries and your loading patterns, but
you can't really because if you throw and you have the parent, if you have,
I think I blocked this. I think as soon as you left, it was like all gone.
If you do something like this and you throw and you have a let's just say higher up in your tree, you have a suspense boundary. That suspense boundary is going to get that throw, and then it's going to suspend that whole tree. So the effect that sets up the router actually never runs, and you're suspended
exactly.
forever.
If the prop that the component that is trying to suspend until this thing is true ends up suspending the tree, and the thing that's going to change the prop from true to false is like a hook that's in the suspended tree, the effect's never going to run. So in this case, the router will never be able to read the URL, query param, flip ready to true, unless that hook is outside of the suspense boundary. So it was a very hacky thing, and it's not
like a tiny
solution.
Right.
It's like you really just want, so this led us into this kind of thought exercise about how well suspense and suspense enabled components or hooks compose with non-suspense enabled hooks and components, and it seems like they basically don't.
It's really, we look at like, okay, so there's a thing we're looking at this as I need to run some code first, and then like I'm ready to render, and there's different versions of that. So there's like the data fetching, like I need to fetch data and I'm not ready to render until I fetch that data. So like I can suspend, and I'm just going to delegate to my parent to show a loading spinner, whatever it wants to do. I'm just suspended. But then there's also things like I want to set up a markdown editor, and I want to show a loading spinner until the markdown editor is ready.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about that, I can't suspend because like I need to do one render that gets like a text area into the DOM. And
so
then
that I can run my effect or whatever.
So that I can like, because like markdown, just imagine a magical function called markdown editor, and it takes an HTML element.
Right.
Like I need that thing to exist.
Right.
And so we think of like both of these, the data fetching and the setting up the markdown editor. There's like loading states. Like I'm loading, but they're fundamentally different. One of them you suspend because you're not yet ready to render. Like I can't render. So I'm just like, this is an invalid state if I render. The other one was setting up the editor. Is like, actually I need to render, and then I need to run some setup code, and then I'm like ready for the user to be interactive, like to be used by the user. And so you would think like, well, I have like loading templates. I have like loading components that I'm using in suspense. I want to use them. I want to like use them throughout my app. I want to use those patterns with the markdown editor, but you can't. You can't. It's like, this isn't suspense now. It's something else. It's like effect setup. My effect isn't ready. And I think a lot of times when we look at Suspense code or we talk about Suspense, it's like, oh, all these fetches that you were doing in effects, they now become suspendable, and you can just get rid of your effects and move them out. But I still
it turns out there's certain kinds of effects you'll still need to.
Yeah, you'll still
won't be able to just suspend and run linearly like that.
Yeah, you'll want to render. And I guess it makes like the Markdown editor makes sense in that.
I wonder if there's a way to split it up though, because like before Suspense, when you're just like using SWR and you get the data and then you get re-renders, it's all one thing. So you have a loading state. With Suspense, you kind of remove the initial loading state. You still have re-renders. And that's basically the route we went down with the auth stuff from Firebase, which is like, let's split it out. Even though we're using the same API, it's kind of interesting. If you can conceptually split it out into the initial work that needs to be done and then updates, maybe there is a way.
I don't think so. I think they're fundamentally different. I think one is like, I am not ready to render, so I'm not going to render my app in like a half state of like some interactivity and then some loading, because that's kind of what we do today. Where Suspense is like, I have a render and then I have a render when I have all the data when it comes back from fetch. Where if you're like doing an effect that's setting something up, it's like you actually do need that middle state. Like,
I guess you just need them to. Yeah. That's
and
true.
you want some way to compose these, because again, the issue that we kind of hit was like, I have a loading template. When my app is loading, I suspend, that renders my loading component. I saying loading template, I mean loading component. We want some mechanism to trigger that with some like our effects that might need to set things up.
It's interesting. Basically, if you need an effect in order to render,
you cannot suspend.
Yeah, but that's like the whole point is, I know, but that's weird because it's like,
no, because you're thinking about it from I have loading, like I have a loading state, and there's all these different ways I can be in my loading state, and that I don't think that's what Suspense is. I think this is like kind of what
I know, but like take the router example, and of course they could re-implement the router such that it suspends. Like it takes a suspend option, but like if you could somehow set the properties on the router of like what the address is. You could do that in module scope.
I mean,
and then you could say the router is ready and then resolve a promise. Like you could create a promise, and then once you're rendering the client, grab the URL and anything else that you needed to wait for the client to get, set it as like a property on the router or some reference that the router has, and then resolve the promise. And now you've just turned this thing into a suspensible thing. And in the same way, like I guess it does, but it doesn't depend on anything being rendered. I guess the Markdown example needs to render in order to add the interactivity. But in that case, it is ready to render the first step.
Yeah, exactly. But they're both from a programmer, from an application developer point of view.
It doesn't have the same
loading states.
Yeah, but it doesn't have the same benefit. Like you can't do it in this latter case. You're saying like you can't get rid of those effects. You can't turn them into steps that suspend because you rely on the rendering output.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk quickly about how Suspense cleans up effects, because it wasn't, I'm still piecing this together, but it wasn't, maybe we've learned a lot about that in the last week or two through our conversations, and even just today, even solidified it a little bit more.
Yeah, I have a really good example. We worked on a client project, like I think this was like last year, where they did like a micro front end architecture where we were in charge of like basically the app loader. And the app loader was like a shell that would figure out like who the user was and then load like sub apps. And we didn't know anything about these sub apps. It was like
black box,
massive,
other team
massive company with massive teams. And we had a contract, which is you can render a React app and we'll supply these things as props to your React app.
Like the current user.
Current user, like we had a bunch of geo information, but yes. And so our like bootstrapping app had a whole bunch of effects that like, okay, what app are you trying to run? Okay, we're going to go get the JavaScript for that app. Once we get the JavaScript for that app, we can like, is it a React app? Is it an Angular app? Like, okay, we didn't go that far, but like there was talks of that. And then we call like app.render. And this was all effects and effect juggling, and the dependency arrays were so difficult because a user could log out. A user could unplug their computer, close it, get on a plane, fly to California, reopen it, and their geolocation would be different. So we have to re-render the app and like this brought up questions like, can the app actually be re-rendered with a different geolocation?
Right.
So we just had, again, I'm getting too into the weeds here, but we had all these effects to manage all this stuff. And it was extremely confusing.
Right.
And we had a ton of test cases and a ton of refactoring that would like break this. Sometimes like it's that funny thing where like you have an effect and you actually have some bug, but you don't realize it until you like get the dependency array right. And you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting the app to be re-rendered with like a new object, but it turns out it can be because you have to satisfy that dependency array.
Right.
Anyway, thinking about this app, it would have been so much easier in Suspense because I could say this component is not ready to render until I fetch the JavaScript for that app, until I know the geolocation.
And then all the code in the defensive code in your effects goes away. The conceptual overhead of thinking about what this effect should do if I'm rendering the first frame or a frame after this thing happens, but this isn't ready, goes away.
So it gives me a way to write my bootstrapping app and say,
as a series of steps,
I am not ready to render
Yeah.
until I have the JavaScript bundle that I'm trying to render. So I don't have to deal with like, what happens if I'm trying to render app X and I don't have app X as JavaScript? Like I literally from my program's point of view,
eliminated
that state
from
doesn't
the code.
exist.
It doesn't exist.
And so,
dude, it's amazing. I mean, think about when we did the stupid expandable animations on the sidebar of MirageJS.com. You put it in effect, you set up some things there, and then it's like, oh, on the first render you haven't fetched like the nav yet, or the in page nav is like dynamically there, and so you have a guard because you're trying to animate something before it's there, or a page expand, like a page is added or something because you expose it, and now it's have to recalculate. You know, there's so much code like this that you could just, if you could just say wait until I have all of the pages. I don't care about it before to add this thing, to render this animation or whatever. There's so much. I think anyone listening to this who's done React can relate to their messy effect code, you know, and having to add guards to use effects because the auth state isn't ready, because you haven't fetched some data. And I mean, there's so much of that in the consulting projects we've done over the last couple of years.
Just having to add a ref to track the work you've done, so you know that that's exactly what you're saying with a guard. Yeah, but like you just add a ref and you start tracking work you've done, and you know you're like violating React, but it's like actually I need to know if I've done these things.
Right. And you know, not only like each effect you write runs right after a successful render, and no async work would stop a render pre-suspense. So that means you have an asynchronous in-between state where the effect's running, maybe you guard it, but you're not done yet. And so now you have two possible things that can happen. The async work can finish, and then maybe you end up calling a set state or a callback up top or something and re-renders. Or you get re-rendered for some other reason. And so now what happens? You're halfway through your effect that's running in a part of your app that really it shouldn't be given the state. You would prefer not to do it. And now you re-render. Have you canceled that work? What happens with a new prop? Do you set it up again? Does it run again because of dependency array? Whatever. All this, dude, it didn't dawn on me how much suspense, which you think about with like, it cleans up effects. Yeah. But there's like a really tight relationship there. Yeah. You know? Yep. And it's like all the stuff that I've been talking about my first 3 videos this year about the composability benefits from the UI perspective and loading states. This doesn't have anything to do with that, because it doesn't have anything to do with that. It's a completely separate point. If you devise some mechanism for a child component to tell a parent that it was loading so that the parent could render a loading spinner up top, or if you had to hoist the data loading, so none of that. This is not about that at all. It's a completely separate point. It has nothing to do with that. It's about how, I mean, I guess under the hood, you're not using an effect to fetch data anymore. So in a sense, it simplifies the effect because you're literally not using it anymore. But like you're saying, I think this is a separate point, which is there are effects you are still going to write in your code. And a lot of times, effects are like the most confusing part of React components, because you skip over them on the first render, you run them after render. It's confusing how they can close over stale state, and they are going to be rerun after render once props change. This makes components very hard to read. You skip them, and then you come back. What's happening? And so suspense, it's almost counterintuitive or not obvious how it simplifies code that seems like it actually could be unrelated to that. It's like, I guess it's related in the sense of like, if you've actually thought about it and put guards up that have to do with asynchronous work, now you can just get rid of those because you can just suspend until those asynchronous steps are ready.
It gives you if you're doing stuff in effects to like bootstrap your component, it gives you a place to put that code to say, I'm not ready yet, which means that now your effect code is just about
it's like tracking, dude. Like, let's say you're setting up tracking. I see this all the time. People have all these different effects that are unrelated, and they just put them in new effects. And then again, understanding how your application runs, your program runs, is very hard and very confusing. Let's say you render a page, you have to fetch some data in one effect, and then you're like, product manager's like, okay, like we want to track page views on this thing, so like add an effect or a hook or whatever that you add a thing that does it. But like now you're tracking, you're setting up tracking, and like the data's not there. Maybe they click on something, but it's not ready yet. You're in a loading state. It's like, okay, it doesn't make sense to track until after you've visited the page. And now you have, by suspending the data fetch, you've now made it way simpler. You never set up tracking analytics until your page is ready and rendered. And so it's like this unrelated thing that has massively been simplified, because maybe that effect that was setting up analytics code was like running again because it's an effect and it reruns because of the dependency is used, but you don't actually want it to rerun. So you have all the dependency arrays, things in the array because you're a good React programmer and you follow the lint rule. But then you have conditions inside the effect that prevent it from running again because logically it doesn't make sense. You just have to account for this thing running again, even though you're just going from like a loading state to a rendered state. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. So you have an effect that does data fetching and then an effect that does analytics, and the effect that does the analytics, like maybe it can't run until the data fetching has come back. So now you're doing
the user or something like that.
Yeah, you're doing juggling and tracking, but in a suspense world, we can actually just suspend the data fetch, and then we can have an effect that just says, yeah, every time I render, track the analytics.
Dude, you don't want to send the user ID, but you don't know the user ID until you fetch the user. So exactly like my video, you want to wait. You don't want the programmer to have to say, oh, if the use current user is status unknown, don't set this up. And then make sure, oh, but now it's not running at all because I only wrote it on mount. Once the current user status goes from unknown to either authenticated or anonymous, I need to rerun this effect and make sure I should track it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I think there's like a like, just to like abstract this, like if you have two effects and you're trying to pass data between them.
Which happens all the time.
Yeah. There's probably like one of them should suspend the component and the other one is like the actual effect you want. So
exactly.
So in this case, it would be like fetching the blog post would suspend the component, but reporting to analytics would be an effect. And you can just trust that effect is only going to run when you have the data you need.
Exactly.
Pretty nice.
It's really nice. I think if you were to do this in a formal state chart, and had all the transitions between them, you would just eliminate a lot of this stuff. Like you wouldn't have to have the lines that go back to the same state. Like user is anonymous. Okay, go back to the same state. We can't go to like is adding analytics. You would just you'd have all these things because you need that, because the app needs to render pre-suspense and it needs to respond to changes and re-renders. But when you're suspending, you're not rendered. Like the code's not being run. You're literally diving out of the function. You don't even have to think about the code that's running after the line that throws the promise, because you've thrown the promise.
Yeah.
It's awesome. So anyways, it's just kind of interesting. It has taken a lot of time of just thinking about the use cases. But
the funny thing about this is in a few years, we're just going to use router suspense true and like not even have to care about any of this stuff. But I think to your point,
if we were talking about Mirage, the REPL that waits for setup code to fetch and all that stuff.
Exactly. I think if you have effects that do analytics and you have guards in there, that stuff just goes away.
Exactly.
Your effect is going to feel like a natural effect and you're not going to be guarding.
Right.
So
Also, Paul Henschel, is it? The Poimanders dude said they've been using Suspense for 2 or 3 years, and there's a lot of code you rewrite to embrace the power of the paradigm. And so I think it will affect how we write code. I think it will affect a lot of the way we write app code, even in a world where libraries have become Suspense ready.
Okay.
I mean,
I have to go through
even in my video from last week, I had the 3 accounts from the bank account with the spinners and then make a spinner over them. If you're handling loading up top, let's say you wanted the loading state, which I just put as a single spinner over all 3. Let's say you want to do skeleton view. You're going to pull that out. It's going to be a separate component. You're going to do it as the parent. And that's like a small change, but you can see how it affects it. And it was nice having like the card and the data stat separate, because you could wrap each one in an error or loading in the parent, or you could wrap all 3. But if I was just making it pre-suspense with use SWR, there probably wouldn't be a separate card and stack component. It would just be one stack component that has the card as well, because it could choose to render that. But then again, if you want to render something above, you're kind of stuck. So I needed a little bit more flexibility in the UI components in order to go between the loading and error states versions, like the critical one, the skeleton one. So there could be stuff like that too that comes out of like moving to Suspense. But overall, man, it's just, dude, yeah, I'm worried about us taking on a contract where we can't use Suspense yet. It's not even ready. Is Suspense ready? The answer is no. But it's how I'm thinking about things now, and it's pretty interesting.
I think so. That's interesting. My view here is that like Suspense would help, but I think a lot of the contract work we would do is like cleaning up those hairy effects.
But like if you look at my code setting up Firebase auth and other apps I've done where it's in effects, it's literally why I ended up installing Zustand in my project, because it made it so much easier to understand. I had tests for all these cases I didn't have before. So if there was a bunch of hairy auth code in some custom provider that people were using to talk to Auth0, their own custom auth backend, being able to pull it out would be awesome.
Yeah.
And I guess there's 2 parts of that. One is pulling out stuff like that's not really tied to render. We've seen clean things up a lot.
Which I think you can do without
Suspense. You can do without Suspense. And then there's a Suspense part, which is once you're doing work there, it'd be nice. Yeah. It'd be nice to guard. It'd be nice to just guard the code.
Right. You eliminate a state from your program. Yeah. And that just makes everything easy.
Always a good thing.
Yeah. Always a good thing.
Cool. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. That'll be up tomorrow, January 28th. And that'll be on, wrapping an observer and it uses Firebase as an example, but you can do it with anything. I mean, the point is like once you get adept with promises and calling resolve from different places with them, then you can create an async function that returns that promise. Then you can just suspend on that async function using the suspend React library, and boom, you're good to go. So it's a pretty cool little story. What else we got on the docket today? What are we at? 50 minutes out of 16, so about 35 or so. Oh, yeah, the remix stuff. I had a lot of thoughts.
Okay.
Maybe we'll do some follow. We'll do more on this next week once you have had a chance to read the Next versus Remix article. But it was pretty interesting for sure. Maybe the only thing I want to talk about today is like I've followed Michael and Ryan a lot over the years. They used to be Ember developers. You were Ember developer while they were Ember developer.
Yeah.
I think I started by that point. Never met them at an Ember conf because didn't quite overlap there. And it's been awesome watching them work. They're pushing a lot of like contrarian perspectives with Remix against the conventional wisdom of like front end SPA development that we're all used to. Things like the SSG is the big one that started with maybe Gatsby, made it most popular. Next adopted it, but like even going back to whatever Jekyll and all those. they're talking about how the cost of that is not worth it. And you can get just as fast by caching dynamic server apps at the edge. And that way you're just building a server app from the beginning, and writing all of your data fetching and mutating code in the server is good because it's the most powerful place. Anyways, we can talk about the details of that next week. What struck me was like, first of all, it's awesome to see people pushing against, what seems to be the conventional wisdom, and showing in cases that like, wow, that actually is pretty compelling. I want there to be, so it reminded me of DHH and Rails, because the same kind of thing happened when Rails came out, and when DHH used to give a keynote every year, there was a lot of times he was trying to push for certain conventions that were according to like the Rails doctrine and how it cleaned up your code and it was better. Resources on Rails, like all of that stuff was like it. When you read this stuff and see these videos, it really has a strong ring to it that reminds you of that stuff. The thing I wish is, and this is not a critique of them or Remix or anything, but I wish it came out of an application, because to me, always one of the most important things of Rails is that it was extracted from Basecamp. Basecamp was like a battle-tested web application that was being used by lots of users over many years. And I think that's the most important thing. So while, again, a lot of the points they make, it's not even just about Next versus Remix, just the stuff they're saying in general has good reasoning behind it and can be compelling. I see things like them using the form component to submit it, which relies on browser behavior or mimics or mirrors it, which is a good thing for X reasons. But then when we want some like concurrent request, or we want some pending state that is more complicated, we drop to like a mutation? It's not a mutation. It's let me just get it real quick. A fetcher, so we can have like end fetchers, because like browsers can only have one form. We use like in the form component, we use like a hidden input to trigger an action. We can get into it next week.
Okay.
Point being, it's hard for me to, that's like what I thought of. And I was like, man, I would be like way more interested in these arguments and this line of reasoning if it came from a multi-year app with a team of people that were shipping, and these in the abstractions came from meeting the real world needs.
You're saying it's like, if it feels like it's almost like the negative, like you look at like React, SSG, SPAs, and you see all the problems they cause, and you say like, okay, a lot of these problems can be fixed if you use like these browser APIs, the forms that submit. Is that what you're saying? But you'd rather see it come out of an app rather than come out of like,
it feels like some of it is ivory tower stuff.
Okay.
No, it's not exactly what you're saying. It's more like, there's problems with how we do things now. It's more just that the abstractions and the APIs, I'm worried that they're too ex nihilo from nothing, I think some of the Ember APIs were bitten by that. They were like dreamt up, whiteboarded in like a smoke-filled room or whatever. You know what I'm saying? They were created and designed, too much design up front and thought about. And so it's like when rubber hits the road, abstractions fall apart. So I think the best abstractions are extracted.
Yes, yeah. We've talked about this. Yeah.
Big time. And that was always something that the Rails community was really good about, whether it was from mailers or jobs or whatever. I even ran this with Mirage, the stuff that I like. The best stuff is the stuff that was extracted from like the repetitive code I was already doing with what I had, and the worst stuff was like not. So, I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate here too, but it's just something that reminded, because of the way they're talking about some of it does ring a bell with that. Something that gave so much weight to Rails abstractions and the kinds of things DHH said was that it was extracted from how they worked. And they said, this is how we're building our web app. And so if these make sense for you, which they probably do, because like most web apps are very similar, then this is how you'll benefit. I don't know if these guys can say this right now. Now they could say these APIs are like battle tests in the sense that they've literally been part of the browser forever.
But that's not what that's not
exactly
what you're saying,
that's not the right. That's different. That's not the same thing. So it's true that forms are battle tested. It's also true that the behavior that's included in HTML forms is so limited and awkward for the kinds of things that people build today that they're literally building other things to get around it. So that's all I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a thought I had. That was like a very high level thought that I had while reading it, which is like, there's obviously these two guys are very smart. It's not just them. Everyone working on the framework is like super smart.
I mean, the reaction they obviously they hit a nail,
and people love it.
They hit a nerve. They struck a nerve.
Yeah,
because you can see people's reaction to everything.
Yeah. Another way to say it is like, I'll be interested to see a year from now, people who are building production apps with Remix, where the abstractions work and where they fall apart. Just like Next's abstractions have worked and fall apart too, and change over
think
time.
That's a very, by the way, I think that's a very like reasonable and mature approach. It's not that like, you're not saying like, oh, this thing is bad or this thing needs to prove itself. It's just saying like, okay, well, given that like, maybe I might not be able to evaluate this stuff. Like I don't have the technical knowledge to evaluate all these like the abstractions that they're building. So like one way for me to evaluate this is just see the success of real world apps in a year from now.
Yeah.
Because that's a very easy thing to evaluate without knowing the knowledge underneath.
Exactly. It's not the abstract knowledge. Is the app successful in a year from now?
Yeah. And it's also, this gives you a way to basically say like, this is like a test I can use without understanding what's going on underneath the hood.
Yes, exactly.
Now, of course, you could be super wrong. Like Rails could be great for the first year and then it dies in a, but it's an interesting way to evaluate technology.
Yeah. And
without feeling like I understand everything.
Yes. And part of this is because of the angle that a lot of the marketing and the docs take is like, we rely on web standards. We want you to learn web standards, but it's like, okay, I don't care about that. That's an implementation detail for me, for the perspective of me using your framework. I believe that. Like, the fact that element.innerText is how you update the DOM. That's a web standard. It's an MDM library. Guess what? It's been completely abstracted away from React. That's a beautiful thing. And I don't need to learn the nuances of it because rendering in React or Vue or whatever have abstracted that API away from me. So just because, now again, I'm kind of taking forms like have behavior that help make our web apps robust and resilient, and that's part of what they're saying. But I'd rather just have a form library that makes my forms robust and resilient.
Yeah.
And if they're going to give a form that hews so closely to the browser form, because we have this kind of altered web standards that we care more about. But then there's cases where it breaks down. Okay, I'm still kind of listening, but I'm going to be much more compelled a year from now if that form abstraction still works out. If every Remix app ends up making an abstraction on top of that, because even in their examples, there's lots of situations where form doesn't work and you have to go to, what was it, Fetcher? You use a Fetcher.
I'm not sure.
So there's two ways to fetch, and there's two ways to like mutate data now. You have a form which works in limited case, which is really robust and does browser behavior, but then as soon as you have like two to-dos you want to close or whatever, you need multiple fetchers. Maybe that doesn't pan out because it's harder, and maybe every team is like, we don't want two ways to do the same thing, it's hard to explain and communicate, we're just going to use an abstraction around this. That's kind of, if that makes sense, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
It does. It's interesting because when they say like built off of web standards, that like goes through like a translation filter in my head, and I kind of think they're saying like, look at all these amazing things a browser can do, and that we like give up when we start just writing like pure SPA apps. Wouldn't it be great if we could like use React, but rely on all the great things a browser can do? I think what you're saying,
whereas I'm saying, which is true, whereas I'm saying like, web standards is a very large bag of things.
Well, you're also saying like web standards don't matter to you. It's more like, can I build a robust app?
That's like what matters. Web standards matter to framework authors because they're the ones giving app developers tools to build robust, resilient apps. So I'm kind of going back and forth here, but I get it. React is extremely hands off in this area. And so if you go to build a form in React, it's very easy to do like button on click, submit the form, save the user. But now you don't have a submit handler on your form. You can't hit enter on the input and just submit it, and you've broken like browser behavior. So from that perspective, it's good for a React developer to understand web standards, obviously, for so many more reasons. Mm-hmm. But then like these are layers on top of the web, the base web APIs. And I don't think like you should have to learn about inner text, because that just happens to be the way the browser, the DOM, updates text on the screen. But as a React developer, that's abstracted. So, the reality is today you have to know about some of them because they're not all abstracted. Obviously, most of them probably aren't, or maybe a lot of them are, a lot of them aren't. Who knows? Mm-hmm. So you have to be aware so that you don't build bad forms or inaccessible web apps or whatever. But yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah.
If your abstractions in your framework actively lead you down a path where it's like the whole pit of success thing. Your obviously framework can't write your app for you, so you're going to have to do things on your own. Are its docs and the ecosystem around it leading you to write apps that like really go against the way the web works and lead you to build like slow and unresilient apps? That's a problem for sure. Is the answer to learn web standards, or is the answer to for better libraries to solve more of that for you? I guess this is always like it's an ongoing problem. But I think maybe what I'm like one way to, and again, so much of I'm just a podcast, I'm just thinking out loud. This is not like, this is not like a super, it's not like I've been thinking about this for a year.
I know, but I think you're being totally charitable. You're being totally charitable. You're not.
I think one way I'm thinking about this is like, if I saw that like the average or even most React apps built with Create React App or Next or whatever were messing up this cancel behavior where you submit a button multiple times and it does multiple submissions. The browser, if you submit a form multiple times, it actually cancels the 1 to n-1 versions of the request. It actually does on its own. It throws them away. It doesn't even listen to the response. It's basically like a BORT controller built into it for an actual HTTP request. Mm-hmm. So then you say like, well, our buttons, our forms in React should do the same thing. And you shouldn't have to I agree, it's a problem to have to track some new state is submitting. Let's ignore the rest, or that wouldn't even be enough because you want to throw away the previous one and use the latest version. Like if you click up on 1 or 2 accounts.
There's an easier solution to this, which is you just put italic text underneath your button that says only press once or your credit card will be charged twice, regardless of what kind of form it is. It
Please
could
don't
be like
press the back button or you might be flying to Australia instead of Hawaii.
Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
So yeah. So yeah, like if you have that form in HTML and you click, the browser does some default stuff. If you have that form in React, you click, the naive version of that form, which is what you would see in the docs, has so much missing from it. And so I think if I were giving a conference talk about this is where I would introduce my form library. And I don't know if this is where I would say we need to, it's like there's lots of ways to solve this problem. And saying you should be familiar with there's some nuance to what I'm saying. I'm having a hard time articulating it. You should be familiar with, web standards so that you understand what behavior it is. But the future I want to see is one where there's a form component provided in React or something like that, that does this. Or yeah. Okay. So I'm getting there.
Yeah, I know.
I'm figuring it out. So Remix has a form component that does a lot of stuff for you, right? Which is great. And it's better than following the form guides from React. Okay. There's libraries like Formic that do similar things. That's fine. But you have to know about them. So Remix provides you with a form that does things like this and submit handlers that do things like this. But then because the web standards is such a core part of the angle and the positioning, you would say do something like use a hidden input to submit this form that triggers like an action on the server. But like you're just doing that because that's how it worked in like in a traditional app, because it's a web standard to do that. But like actually, I'd rather you just have an API on your form button that does the same thing and lets me pass a value, kind of thing.
Okay.
Does that make sense? It might make sense once you read the article more. We talk more about it.
I think
there's like parts where I feel like they're just going straight to the moon, and it's like they're flying 1,000 miles an hour and they're on point. And then I see something where I'm like, wait, I don't care about that hidden input just because that's how you had to do it in PHP. You can give me, it should be part of the abstraction.
Your inner HTML example, I think, is really good here, because you're saying that, like, yeah, there's a world where you need to know all about inner HTML, but then it gets abstracted away with a really good library.
Right, exactly.
And so now you actually
web standards don't matter.
Yeah.
So this is where like web standards matter, because you need to know that you want to use submit handlers on forms instead of click handlers on buttons that say okay, because you want enter to work on the input. So that's like where web standards matter. But web standards don't matter for like inner HTML because you don't care about it, or like web standards don't matter. You know, it's again
nuance being charitable.
Yeah. Web standards are like no longer relevant the same way like details of TCP/IP are relevant. They not that they don't matter. They've been abstracted away, and I want more of them to be abstracted away. And also, like
your ideal framework is just component my app, close
exactly.
Import my app from framework.
Siri, make me my application. And then beyond that, beyond like abstracting away APIs that are like hard and also like just too complex, like inner HTML takes in like anything and a string and all this stuff. But like from a perspective of a React developer, you just want like elements and components. So it's good that it's like more specific and not as general and not as powerful, right? It's like power, rule of least power, all that. So there's abstracting away things from web standards so that you don't have to use them and know them as well, which is good because good abstractions help us move forward. There's also parts of the web model that are confusing and like ill-suited for some of the things that we're building. So like the web, you could argue the web is not like the ideal platform for a lot of the kinds of apps. We work on apps. We work on back office, long-lived applications. That's why we like SPAs. That's why we like Ember and React and all this. And that's not what the web was designed for. Now, it's fine to say like, well, the web is what we have, and you want to embrace the aspects of it so that you end up with like better user experiences, which is true. But it's also true that like, yeah, we, you know, Ajax came around after, like Ajax didn't always exist in the browser. iframes or whatever, Canvas didn't always exist in the browser. One day we'll have WebAssembly, you know, that didn't always exist. And so all of that to say, if the only way to trigger an action in 1999 was to submit a form with a hidden input, doesn't necessarily mean we should be doing that today. There might be a better way to do it.
Yeah, or you're saying like
it's not really to me. There's no real like that's not a thing I care about. That's not like a benefit that's how we used to do that, and that we can do it like that today.
This could be just too like the it's not aimed at you. Like I don't think every framework has to make everyone happy.
Yeah,
and so like there probably are some people that get like, you know, like, I don't know, you're like a backend developer and you tried Angular, you tried Ember, and it feels like you have to learn a new framework every 2 years.
Yeah.
And now there's a framework out there that's like, it's React, but it's embracing web standards. And guess what? I know how forms work.
Right.
And so it's pretty cool that I can like use that knowledge.
Right. That's true.
By the way, I agree with you. Like I want that stuff abstracted away.
Yeah.
I want a good abstraction that doesn't leak, similar to TCP when I'm making an AJAX request.
Exactly. So yeah, I thought it would be fun to just kind of brain dump on the podcast because it's so early. I've read a few articles. I haven't even used it yet. I'm definitely going to. I want to make some videos on it.
You know what's funny? Like
I'm excited about it. But the web standards thing, honestly, as a positioning angle and a marketing angle, to me, it doesn't really speak to problems that I
Interesting.
have. Now, once they start talking about it, it's like, oh wait, my button doesn't like automatically cancel stale request, and I have to think about that, and I didn't. But it's like, okay, then give me show me that your framework does that.
Yeah.
That's the bug that I have, and your framework solves it. The fact that it's because of it's how the browser works, I actually don't care about that.
Yeah, totally. You know, it's funny. For me, Remix acknowledging like a full app with back-end code and front-end code is like awesome.
Yep.
Right. That's what I want. And then second, the whole server rendered thing, it like really makes me think. Right. Because I was just like SPAs and then SSG. And it's like, no, what if you could actually server render? Like, I mean, I have so much of my web development career is in like PHP and Rails. Like,
writing controller code in Rails.
Yeah.
And it's like you can touch
I have
the
a lot
user and render the page with the data from the database. Holy smokes.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
But like the tension there was always you're writing in Rails or PHP and you're not, you know, eventually you're going to want the whole thing to be JavaScript because you need the auto-completing dropdown and you need tests for that and blah, 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 blah. So it's pretty cool. It feels like this gets me closer on that front. So I think that's where I would be excited to use this is I want to write like a server rendered React app and I want like a full stack app where I'm writing on the back end and the front end. So I think that's a thing like why.
But that's interesting because that doesn't excite me today because I don't write my back ends anymore. I think like sending an email and like being able to test it within a single framework code base would be cool.
I think we use Susura. I'm really happy with Susura, but like it's just non-starters for certain projects. It's just like
for sure,
even if it's like technically hits all the boxes. We've been on projects where we recommend Susura. We know it's a perfect fit, and the answer is no. So
there's still something conceptual I really am attracted to about starting with full SPA on the client, and then do like if you need a marketing page. Like there's something really, to me, there's something still elegant about data fetching, data mutation on the client.
Yeah.
You get the optimistic UI. I mean, if you're built, you
I know, but like, so like I've been thinking about this and like, you know, that's a position that I've had for like the last 5 years. Like everything should be in SPA.
Right.
And I still feel that way because JavaScript is so powerful.
Right.
I think it's when you're writing a Rails app and you submit a form, it's like, that's it. You've just submitted the form, that's it. And you wait for the next controller to render. And there's so much that the SPA has to do.
Yeah.
It has to juggle is loading, all the things you just talked about. Yeah. And teams that are developing SPAs don't do that. And not because they're bad programmers. They don't do that. They don't have time. They don't know to do that.
Is huge.
And so that stuff gets skipped. And then you end up with these apps that are, I mean, they're buggy. Like,
no, it's true. It's there's a difference between you're building with,
and
Wikipedia or Basecamp, and then like we're building Slack. So obviously we need a lot of client code. It's like that. You look at Slack and it's like, this is a client app. Yeah. It's like needs to run a fat client. Like it just has to. But there's a lot of in between the middle class where people are pushed into the fat client technology or like SPA technology when really like forms and links are basically the only interaction you need. And and erring on the side of like and erring on the side of the server. Sorry, it's a bad term. Falling more on the side of the server in those situations would be a lot better for for that huge class of apps.
I think there's so many reasons for this. Like, just
I know, but like we've worked on so many of those apps too, and then you always want to add things to make the app better that involve the client, and so then you're back to this like that's what always happens because everyone's using iPhones and modern apps, and there's so many interactions that go beyond forms and links, which is basically if you're in a purely server rendered world, literally the only interaction the user can have with your app is forms and links.
I know, but this discussion involves trade-offs that are out of our control. But like you'd want like a really strong product manager to say like, we're not going to do that.
Sure.
Or we are. But I do feel that so many apps we've been involved with pick React and SPA for the sake of that's our stack.
Yeah.
That's how you build front ends today.
Yeah. And the reality is, even if we like it ourselves and it's fun to build like a podcast site with it for fun, it would be a lot easier to build a podcast site with Rails.
Not even a real. I'm talking real. I'm
true.
talking real
Yeah,
apps.
yeah.
And
No.
I can sit here and I can say, given an unlimited budget, I can build any React app that's just as good as a Rails app. And in fact, I can make it even better because I control the whole life cycle of that app.
Yeah.
But the reality is that like the projects we get pulled into, they're
they face time and constraint budgets, resource budgets. So.
Yeah.
No, it's so all that to say, I do love that they're drawing attention to the ways in which the average SPA is in a really bad spot, and it is, maybe the average React app or whatever. The aspects of the average app that fall short because the framework did encourage people to make cool drop downs that are so easy to build now. He called it the curse of React one time. It's so easy and fun to build that you reinvent things instead of learning about the fundamentals and relying on it. And so you're building these half-working apps or these apps that aren't resilient or that they're slower than they should be. So I love that he's calling attention to that. I just still want a world where we get both those things.
Yeah.
Why not both?
Yeah.
Why not a framework that lets us build the fun things, but also catches us when we, fall back to the bad patterns or whatever. So,
Yep. I agree.
yeah. So anyways, can't wait to play more with it. And I know some people were asking about it too. So it seems like it's going around for sure. People are excited about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say, like, I'm excited about it. I don't feel like I'm under
You don't
the gun
feel
to
pressure
use it.
to learn it or use it.
But here's why. Like, I got involved in React 5 years too late.
Right.
And I'm fine.
Right. Exactly.
You know what I mean? So like,
no, that's a good reminder for, especially if folks are new to the industry. I remember feeling like that when I started out. Yeah, these days I've got gray. I'm turning 35 soon. You can actually see every day. I don't know what this is, like a cruel joke that biology is playing on me, but it's true. It's not. Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be fun to port a Next app to Remix just because so much of my Next code is just React.
Yep.
And then see how I could take advantage of like the loaders and stuff like that and refactor some of it. But yeah, no, I think back to what you're saying, I think it's good for people to hear, especially if you're newer to the industry, is I basically wait until I have a problem to learn something. I've never run Docker before. Actually, I had to once on a client project, I think. I've never used it. I don't care about it. I've never had a problem that it solves, or like that I know about, or have experienced a problem enough to go look for a solution. And that's kind of how I think about it. And right now, I still have so much to learn about Next, and just working with React and the libraries that are coming out in Suspense and all these things. So that's kind of where I'm being pulled.
Cool.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Hey, hour 20. I guess it's a little over an hour clocked in for the pod, but if you made it this far, thank you for listening. That's a nice shirt. Where's that from? Is that All Saints?
Yeah, it's All Saints.
That's a nice one. Good job, buddy. Remember 5 years ago when you used to wear like orange socks with brown shoes? You remember that?
I've never owned a pair of orange socks.
Okay, I think they were just white with like a red stripe, and like your jeans were halfway up your calf.
They were probably like gray shoes with black socks, or black socks with.
You've come a long way, my friend, both in programming and in style. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.
See ya.